Whispers in the Graveyard, a Night of Haunting. The graveyard shift always had a way of filling my nights with a strange mix of dread and fascination. As a security guard at the abandoned Whispering Pines Cemetery, I had grown accustomed to the eerie silence that enveloped the place during the witching hours. However, on this particular night, something was different. Something sinister lingered in the air. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, ghostly shadows across the tombstones. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the rustling of leaves in the wind seemed to mimic faint whispers. I clenched my flashlight, trying to dispel the unease that had settled deep within me. I patrolled the cemetery grounds, my footsteps echoing through the eerie quietness. Every now and then, a gust of wind would send shivers down my spine as it brushed against my neck like a phantom's touch. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the gravestones themselves were keeping a watchful eye on me. My heart quickened as I passed by a particularly weathered mausoleum. The name on it had faded with time, but a cryptic inscription remained etched into the stone. Here lies those who never found peace. My flashlight's beam flickered for a moment, casting eerie shadows on the moss-covered walls. I shook my head and continued on my rounds. As the hours dragged on, the sense of unease intensified. Strange noises filled the night. The distant cry of a lone owl, the creaking of ancient trees, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it was something more sinister. The graveyard had always been a place of solace for me, a sanctuary where I found solace in the company of the departed, but tonight, that sanctuary had become a twisted nightmare. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing in a desperate rhythm. Then I heard it, a faint, mournful wail that sent shivers down my spine. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. It was as if the very ground beneath me was crying out in agony. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source of the haunting sound. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the oldest section of the cemetery. With trembling legs, I ventured deeper into the graveyard, the wail growing louder with each step. The moonlight filtered through the branches above, casting eerie patterns on the ground. The tombstones in this part of the cemetery were ancient, their inscriptions worn away by time. I finally reached the source of the wail, a weathered mausoleum nestled among the oldest graves. The moonlight revealed the name on the entrance, the Whitaker family. The cry seemed to emanate from within, as if the very souls of the departed were trapped inside. Summoning all my courage, I pushed open the heavy door, and a rush of icy air greeted me. The interior was even colder than the night air outside, and a faint bluish glow filled the chamber. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. I could hear the wail now, more clearly than ever, and it seemed to come from a small crypt in the corner. As I approached, the crypt's door creaked open of its own accord. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, the sense of dread growing with each passing second. Inside the crypt, I found myself surrounded by ancient coffins. The air was suffocating, and the wailing grew louder, echoing through the chamber. I pointed my flashlight toward the source, and my heart stopped. There in the corner stood a figure, a woman dressed in tattered white funeral attire. Her face was obscured by a veil, but her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. She stretched out her hand toward me, and her voice, now clear and mournful, filled the chamber. "Help us," she whispered, her voice like a cold breeze through a graveyard. I stumbled back in terror, unable to tear my eyes away from the apparition. The wailing intensified, and I could feel 100 eyes upon me, 100 souls trapped in this crypt, all pleading for release. In that moment, I knew I had stumbled upon something beyond my understanding. I fled the crypt, the wailing following me like a haunting melody. As I emerged into the moonlit night, I realized that the graveyard shift had turned into a living nightmare. I left the Whispering Pines Cemetery that night, vowing never to return. The eerie silence and the haunting wails of the departed would forever haunt my dreams. I had witnessed something that defied explanation, something that whispered of a darkness that lurked in the shadows of the graveyard shift, a darkness that would forever remain a chilling mystery. Trapped in the Hollow Grove, a night of descent. The night shift at the Meadowbrook Hospital was a lonely and eerie experience, especially in the psychiatric ward. As the clock struck midnight, I settled into my routine of checking on the patients, making sure they were safe and sound. The fluorescent lights cast an unsettling glow on the sterile white walls, and the occasional sound of distant footsteps echoed through the empty halls. One particular patient, John, had always stood out among the others. He was a tall man in his late 30s with a scraggly beard and wild, bloodshot eyes. He had been admitted after a series of violent outbursts, but he hadn't spoken a word since his arrival. He spent his days and nights sitting on his bed staring at the wall, a silent, brooding presence. On this particular night, as I made my rounds, I noticed something different about John. He was standing by the window, his back to me, gazing out into the moonlit darkness. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting an eerie pallor over his figure. I approached cautiously, wondering what had drawn him from his usual perch. "John," I said softly, "is everything okay?" He didn't respond, but I could see his shoulders tense up. He seemed to be staring at something outside, something I couldn't see. I followed his gaze but saw nothing but the empty hospital courtyard. I placed a hand on his shoulder and he jumped, his eyes wide with fear. He finally turned to look at me and I saw something in his eyes that chilled me to the bone. It was a look of sheer terror, as if he had seen something beyond comprehension. "John, you're safe here," I reassured him. "Tell me what's wrong." He shook his head, unable to find his voice, and pointed urgently toward the window. I stepped closer to the glass and squinted into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, but then a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, shadowy figure with long, bony fingers and eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. I gasped and stumbled back from the window. John's fear was contagious, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The figure outside began to move closer, slowly but steadily, as if it were approaching with deliberate purpose. "Lock the door!" John suddenly shouted, breaking his silence. "Keep it out." I rushed to the door, fumbling with the lock, my hands trembling. John joined me, his strength surprising given his normally subdued demeanor. Together we secured the door just as the figure reached it. The thing outside let out a guttural, inhuman growl that sent shivers down my spine. It pressed its face against the glass, its features contorted in a grotesque, nightmarish grimace. Its eyes bore into mine, and I could see a malevolent intelligence in their depths. "What is it?" I whispered to John, unable to tear my gaze away from the creature. He shook his head, his lips trembling with fear. "I don't know, but it's not from this world. It's been tormenting me, trying to get inside my head." We watched in horror as the creature's fingers scraped against the glass, leaving behind long, jagged scratches. It seemed to be testing the strength of the door, searching for a way in. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as we huddled in that dimly lit room, the creature outside growing more relentless by the minute. Its growls and hisses filled the air, and the room grew colder with each passing moment. I could see my breath in the air, and I knew we were in the presence of something malevolent and otherworldly. Hours passed, and the creature eventually retreated into the darkness. We remained locked in the room, too terrified to venture out. It wasn't until the first rays of dawn began to filter through the curtains that we finally felt safe enough to leave our sanctuary. The hospital staff arrived for their morning shift, and we recounted our harrowing ordeal. They searched the grounds but found no trace of the creature. John was transferred to a more secure facility, but he never spoke again, forever haunted by the horrors he had witnessed. As for me, I left the night shift behind, unable to shake the memory of that night. I knew that something had come for John, something not of this world. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was a darkness that lurked in the shadows of the night, waiting for its next victim, and I prayed that I would never encounter it again. The asylum's dark watch, a night of torment. The night was dark and silent as I settled into my new job as a nightguard at the abandoned Oakridge Asylum. The vast, decaying building loomed over me, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in layers of grime and decay. It had been closed for years, and my task was simple: watch over the empty corridors and keep an eye out for any trespassers. I had just settled into the security office, dimly lit by the glow of the bank of surveillance monitors, when the radio on the desk crackled to life. A voice, distorted and eerie, whispered, "I'm watching you." My heart skipped a beat as I grabbed the radio and responded, "Who is this?" Show yourself." There was no response, just an unsettling silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I scanned the monitors, searching for any signs of movement, but there was nothing. The asylum remained as empty and desolate as ever. I shook off the uneasy feeling and tried to convince myself that it was a prank or interference on the radio. But then the voice returned, now more sinister and menacing. "You can't hide from me. I see everything." Panic surged through me as I realized that I was not alone in the asylum. I picked up my flashlight and cautiously approached the security office door, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. There was nothing there, just the eerie silence of the abandoned building. As I retreated back into the office, a loud, echoing bang reverberated through the corridor. I froze, my heart pounding, as the voice on the radio grew louder and more frantic. "Let me in! Let me in now!" The banging on the door continued, each thud growing more violent and desperate. I pressed the radio to my lips and shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice on the other end laughed, a chilling, maniacal sound that sent shivers down my spine. "I want you to see me. I want you to know that I'm here." I turned my attention back to the surveillance monitors, and my blood ran cold. Shadows moved across the screens, unnatural and ghostly. It was as if something was lurking just beyond the reach of the cameras, something that defied explanation. Then, one of the cameras displayed a chilling image, a grotesque creature with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. It stared directly into the camera, its gaze piercing through the screen and into my soul. I stumbled back in horror, dropping the radio. The voice on the other end continued to taunt me. "I won't let you go, Nightguard. You are mine now." Desperation overcame me as I scrambled to pick up the radio. "Please, just leave me alone. What do you want from me?" The banging on the door grew louder, and the creature in the surveillance camera continued to leer at me with its malevolent eyes. It spoke one final message, its voice a chilling whisper that filled the room. "I want your fear. I want your soul." With that, the radio fell silent, and the banging on the door stopped. I was left alone in the darkness, my heart racing, my mind haunted by the nightmarish presence that had tormented me. The hours passed in a haze of terror as I sat alone in the security office, my eyes fixed on the surveillance monitors, dreading the return of the creature. But it never came back, and the voice on the radio remained silent. As dawn broke, I stumbled out of the asylum, my body and mind exhausted from the night of torment. I had survived, but I knew that I would forever be haunted by the night I spent as a nightguard at the Oakridge Asylum, a night when I had come face to face with a malevolent entity that hungered for my fear and my soul. Thanks for watching. To support us, please like and subscribe.